Alrighty, it's that time. The Thursday review is back, and this particular one was brought to my attention. And I knew this was going to be a good one to go through. Ignorance of history and political differences in perception of racism in the United States. In the journal Social Psychology and Personality Science. So let's have a look at this. It's the Thursday night study review returns. Let's go. Okay, so before I start, just some housekeeping. I've been finding it's been difficult to keep up and give a lot of time to the reviews as I would like to give them by doing them once a week. So I'm going to switch them to every other week. So this will be this one, and then the next one will be 2 weeks from tonight. So just FYI, if you're looking for it, kind of thing. And of course, don't forget to pop on over to Locals after this premiere airs on YouTube, and you can join us for the live chat after show where we discuss the article and more there. So this one caught my attention. It was sent to me by a by a friend, by a friend and viewer of this channel, and figured it would be interesting to go through for sure. In part because this actually isn't an old topic for social psychological and personality science kind of discipline. Apparently, it's been present, and the ideas have been present for close to 30 years because the Marley hypothesis that they talk about in here was first it was first proposed by a person going by the name of Marley, of course. And it is it's an interesting hypothesis, and I do believe quite grounded in postmodernist philosophy, which is unfortunate. But let us get into that. There's some interesting things. I did some digging with this and actually found I got a hold of the questions that were used in the survey part of this, and I do think there's some problems with that. So first off, the abstract. According to the Marley hypothesis, white Americans are more ignorant of historical racism than black Americans, which explains their greater tendency to deny racism in the present. We extended the Marley hypothesis by testing whether it explains political differences in perception of racism among white Americans in the United States. Two pre-registered studies measured participants' knowledge of historical racism as well as their perception of present racism in individual cases and in society. White Republicans had less knowledge of historical racism and perceived less individual and systemic racism than white Democrats. Consistent with the Marley hypothesis, political differences in perception of individual racism were significantly mediated by knowledge of historical racism. These findings suggest that ignorance of historical racism may partly explain why white Republicans perceive less racism than white Democrats, and therefore extend the Marley hypothesis to the political realm. Okay, because as I said, the Marley hypothesis, yeah, the Marley hypothesis is certainly interesting, and greater tendency to deny. Yeah. In a way, I would mark on that, and just I would remark on that in the idea that, just because you have greater knowledge of the past doesn't mean you think certain things are racist today. And I'm going to point this out, particularly when I get to the questions that were being asked, because I don't think, if you're thinking about it in a nuanced way, in the complexities of societal interactions, that you can necessarily say anything. You can necessarily say anything about any of the particular items that they gave. So we'll get there in a second. So let's see. They're going on with the prejudice and history kind of bit. Let's do. Evidence of racism is found in society more broadly, including large disparities in criminal justice, education, employment, health, and housing. I'm going to point that out again right there. Here, if the focus is on disparities, I'm sorry, disparities do not prove discrimination. That is a single cause fallacy. And of course, the works of Roland Fryer, among others, point to the notions that once you start controlling for some of the other things, a lot of those disparities tend to go away amongst individual groups. So there is that too, just to point out that there's a piece here that was not mentioned by the authors. Scholarship on the Marley hypothesis, which we which argues the ignorance of historical racism blunts perception of racism in the present. Here, and it's mentioned again here. These two studies figure prominently because the questions, in part, that they used in this survey come, from this particular study by Nelson. So 2013. So you see, this is almost 10 years old in here. So what are they testing in this study? Here we test for the first time whether one, white Republicans are more ignorant of historical racism than white Democrats, and political differences in perception of present racism are mediated by historical knowledge. And so that's what they're getting into with this, is the whole idea. And the reason some of this is concerning is some of the later language that they use, which I'm just looking at it like, what now? when I read this. Let's see, some other things I noticed going along here. Okay. Some interesting things, of course. White Americans are more likely to deny racism when they strongly identify with their racial group. I've noticed this a fair bit, and this is going to be informed by some of the questions that they ask that I want to get into with this, that, I question whether or not the participants in surveys have the same definition that they have in terms of running the survey. And that is kind of a big deal because the interpretation of the survey that you put out there kind of matters in all these different things. So, let's see. Informed by the Marley hypothesis, we propose that white Republicans have worse knowledge of historical racism than white Democrats, which should also exacerbate the denial of racism. Should it? Should it? Are those two things really mutually intertwined? You could be very knowledgeable. You could be very, very knowledgeable, actually, and then say, no, I don't think this is true because I don't think this is presently racism that we have now in this particular situation and examples and all that kind of stuff. So, no, it doesn't necessarily exacerbate the denial of racism. Those two things don't necessarily go together. They can. Not going to deny that. They could very much, but they don't necessarily do all the time. According to this hypothesis, impoverished knowledge of historical racism dulls perceptions of racism in the present. Let's see. Together, research on the Marley hypothesis suggests that knowledge of historical racism mediates group differences in perception of present racism, and furthermore, that teaching white Americans about the history of racism may reduce these differences. Let's see. Research at Diverse University in the Southeast failed to support the mediation proposed by the Marley hypothesis. And there's some other things here I want to say about this when we get into some of the numbers. Thus, when viewed cumulatively, research suggests that white people's knowledge of historical racism and perception of present racism vary considerably across contexts. Yeah. We explore whether political orientation is a factor. So they go and argue in this section. They talk about in this section how there was a lot of pushback on certain things, and talking about the media diet of Republicans versus Democrats. And admittedly, that is something that's there and is a challenge because, you do have one group that just listens to one thing and one group that listens to another thing. Although I would point out, I forget the study that was, I forget which study it was years ago that pointed out that conservatives actually tend to listen to a broader range of opinion than progressives do. So that would kind of tend to refute some of this. I forget which study it is. It's been a while since I've looked at it, so I'd have to go dig it out again. But I do remember hearing about that said study. Let's see. In short, versus resulting in a greater tendency to appreciate the lingering effects of racism today. Along these lines, an award-winning journalist who developed a series of articles on historical racism called the 1619 Project was initially denied tenure from her university after her objections to her work were raised by Republicans. I don't think it was just Republicans, as I recall correctly. with that one who were aggravated with her. Um, but that's a whole other thing. The 1619 project presumes that at least in its initial stage, that the founding of the American of the U.S. happened several after, and it happened 100 some odd years before it actually happened, when slaves were brought over from Africa. And there was actually quite a number of historians, as I recall correctly, who called it out for the factual inaccuracies that the 1619 project has, many times over. So there is that, by the way. Let's see. White Republicans perceive much less racism than white Democrats, both in individual cases and in society. So that's Pew Research. Informed by the Marley hypothesis, we propose that political differences in perception of racism are mediated by knowledge of historical racism, and present two pre-registered studies that test this hypothesis. Specifically, internet respondents who identified as white and either members of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party completed measures assessing knowledge of historical racism, racial identity, as well as perception of individual and systemic racism. Okay, so I do want to talk about these here. It's the same set of questions for both studies, actually, that they used here. And that's why, where did I put the first page? I flipped over oh, here it is. And I do want to talk about that because the questions themselves, when I was looking at them, I was thinking of a lot of different things in terms of it being potentially in its construction biasing the study. And that's kind of what I'm concerned about with it. And I don't think very much of the study to begin with, but which I'm going to give you my opinion honestly. I don't think very much of this particular study. Certainly an interesting idea to look at it, but not necessarily accurate and not necessarily good study, because I'm not so sure this wasn't done in I'm not so sure the questions didn't push a particular response or weren't constructed in a particular way. It kind of bugs me. Let's put it that way. It just bugs me a serious amount. And the other reason that this bugs me is with their conclusion that, white Republicans are ignorant, apparently, according to them, and that's why that is the push to, with media being what it is, and studies being pulled out there, put in newspapers and things like that, and I didn't check to see if there was a press release or not for this, but the tagline for a news media agency would be, Republicans are ignorant of history, therefore they don't see racism as much as the rest of us. And that is a talking point of all talking points, to just say, Republicans are evil people. However, as we're going to get into the questions, I'm going to talk about a little something here that I did over the last couple of days to gauge these questions. So we shall see whether or not I think of this. So participants. So the first study they did was December 2020. Data collected. Participants restricted to white American adults who were born and reside in the United States, who were using a computer, not a mobile device. 100 approved hits. Yeah, you only got 80 cents for participating, which is a really, really cheap amount of money to pay somebody. 231 respondents. So this is how both of them were constructed. Both of the studies were constructed. After demographic items, and this in this specific order. After demographic items, participants completed a Black History quiz, which consisted of 16 items assessing knowledge of historical racism against Black Americans. Next, participants completed 2 measures of perceived racism by responding on a scale from 1 to 7, 1 being not at all, 7 being certainly, to indicate how certain they were that each of the series of items reflected racism. The first included 9 items assessing perception of systemic racism. The second included 5 items assessing perception of individual racism. Now, I want to give a point on this. I want to know, because I don't think they did it, I want to know whether or not the participants were given a definition of what racism is. And the reason I want to know that is because quite often nowadays, if you're going with the postmodernist woke version of what racism is, which is prejudice plus power, effectively, or including in all of the systemic little bits that where there is ever a disparity, significant disparity that is always the result of systemic racism. If you go by the postmodernist approach with critical theory, that would be the predominant thinking and worldview approach of it. But if you're going by the more traditional definition of racism having to do with the belief, the fundamental belief that one race is superior to another, which is abhorrent, mind you, those are two different definitions. And so if you were asked in this survey to say how certain you were that each of these items reflected racism, you would have to also, unless you provided the definition for them to go by, the participants are going by whatever definition they have themselves, not by whatever definition that they think that the authors of this study think is the correct definition. And so that's a point to make in this is I'm always very critical with survey related studies because what the authors have as a definition for a word or for a concept may not be at all the same as their participants. Particularly in something like this where it's very sensitive, and right now there is two very different definitions because you've got the woke version of woke version of what racism is, and you've got traditional enlightenment values version of racism defined. So let's see. Participants also completed a 4-item measure of racial identity, and there's something about that I'm going to get to also. So there's a lot of things in here that I find really, really concerning with the questions. So we're actually going to switch and go over to the questions, and the text might be a touch small, but don't worry. As always, these references will be included in the description for you, so have no fear. So, you might, oh, wait a second, let me go back. You might notice right here, the study they're referring to here is Bonham et al. 2019. And seeing as that's what they cited here, I went back to that study to pull what the questions were that were used in this study. And it's used in multiple places here. So, and yeah, the Bonham study actually draws from the Nelson study, so I'm pretty sure these are quite the right questions. Here, when I'm looking at them, involved in this particular set of materials. So, with that in mind, we're going to be looking at those questions. And as I said, this is probably going to be a little bit small, but we will make it work here. Looking at some of these questions. So let me switch back to that. So yeah, this is from that journal, the Bonham study itself here, and the part down here that I want you to see, study 1, from the Nelson studies, right? Here, this is the critical historical knowledge, and what they were doing in the Zell study, the one that I'm reviewing for you all tonight regarding political things, is that everybody who participated after giving their demographic answers was asked, true, false, what do you think? Is this true? Is this false? In these 16 bullets in here. And then from that, they calculated a hit rate, which is to say how many of the true ones did you get right and call true, and a false alarm rate, which is to say how many of the false ones did you get falsely. And there's some of these things here, a lot of these that I knew because I did, I actually knew quite a lot of these myself when I was looking at this, without looking at the answers myself. I knew a lot of these for myself because it's an interest in history is something that I have. But there is not a guarantee with these that someone who is general public, general education, has an interest in society with this stuff, would generally know these things, know all of these things. There's some of them that they certainly would, if they had good education in high school. But then again, see the video on proficiencies in 12th grade as of 2019. I can assure you it's not great in proficiencies in anything. So history in general, but it is certainly some interesting things. So one of the things I noticed with these is that every single one of the 16 had a very negative framing to them. And like I said, these history questions came before the questions on perception of systemic racism and perception of individual racism. And we'll get into that in a second. But this is somewhat aggravating when I look at it here, because they're entirely negatively framed. And the framing does matter. Now, and admittedly, in the original Nelson study, there was some celebratory things, and I would have liked to see some of the celebratory things be back in present also. But in here, they focused entirely on negative events or negative things. There's nothing wrong with having negative events in there, but when you're talking about a survey where you're getting to the end and you're doing then perceptions of systemic or individual racism and then going onto the collective identity thing, the question that immediately comes to mind with me, and I actually had a chat with a few folks on this one because I was curious of their thoughts, was, if you're framing it like this, where you're starting with all of these negative questions first, and maybe perhaps you're learning some of this for the first time, how does that lead into the other stuff that comes on here? That's the kind of thing that I want to know with this. And it's just very, very okay. So I guess the question that I have here is, I wonder how the results would have changed had the authors here interspersed in this set of questions, this set of 16, some more positive facts of Black history that I know are there. It's like Frederick Douglass and the likes. I'm quite aware. But they didn't with this, and I have to wonder, why is that? Why did you focus only on the negative questions, or the negatively framed questions, and then lead into perceptions of systemic and individual racism? And that is quite a concern. The other thing I had quite a concern about is, like I said, right now in general, civics and history in the United States, amongst the other topics that are being taught, the proficiency numbers when you get out of 12th grade are very, very low. Did a whole video on that some time ago. It hasn't changed all that much. So I wonder in the question that unless you're really interested in history, would you have gone to look for it? So in other words, well, unless you're really interested in history, would you have known the answer to these questions? If you just come out of high school with your general history knowledge, would you have known the answer to this? And the answer may be probably not. So I do wonder if they didn't really match the questions to the amount of knowledge the average person may have, and if some of these are somewhat niche. And I'll give you an example. The question that they have here, number 7, Medgar Evers struggled for the civil rights of Black Americans and was assassinated for his writings. I didn't know who Medgar Evers was, and I actually knew most of the rest of these on here straight away. And at the same time, I didn't know that one. That was really, really niche. And some of these are really, really niche, that unless you're really interested in history, you wouldn't know them. And I mean just history generally. And so I wonder, did this quasi bias that way? That, this might be some of these might be a little too specialized. I'm still thinking the framing was very negative, which is when it leads into the other questions about what have you. There's definitely definitely a distinct concern that the negative framing would affect the rest of the test. That's a distinct current concern that I have with this. Um, but let's see. Okay. These are the other questions that came up with respect to isolated instances of racism versus what they deem to be systemic. And the participants here were asked, for each of these, do you think that how certain are you that these things reflected racism? Now, at this juncture, I think it's prudent to give a brief primer with critical race theory, which is being taught. There's demonstrable evidence is being taught, and primarily by praxis, not necessarily by actual structured lessons, although there's some of that also in schools, in colleges for sure, and it is in many places how DEI programs are structured around is CRT. CRT, in the book Critical Race Theory and Introduction, authors Delgado and Stefanczyk lay out that their first tenet is that racism is endemic to society. Racism is everywhere. This is a conclusion that they start from, actually, and everything else is based off of that. And so the job of the critical race theorist, according to Delgado and Stefanczyk, is to sniff it out everywhere, in every manifestation and what have you. In other words, if an individual instance has never actually happened, well, no, it happened somehow. We just got to figure it out. Figure out where it is and, show it to the world and what have you. This is a biased perception because, as I said, critical theory starts from the conclusion that society is racism is endemic to society in the U.S., which is not been demonstrated as being proven true empirically, at least not to my knowledge. But because of this, it's also catastrophizing thinking, actually, to think every instance has gotten racism in it somewhere. So in that sense, a postmodernist person, or some more exposed to that thinking, or if you will, the colloquial woke, they're more likely to respond, quite possibly, with a 7 for a lot of these different things, meaning they certainly think these were examples of racism. Whereas somebody else who is not in that vein and recognizes the nuance of a situation, of an individual situation, would not. And when I ran some of these questions by a few folks that I know, they struggled to answer it. They took a lot of time to answer it, in part because they're like, well, it could be, but I don't know what the people are actually thinking in the situation, or what's going on, or what have you. And the same thing with some of the other things here, unless it's quite clearly a situation where I would look at that as like being a problem. Here, and I gotta make a point and notice on a couple of different things because there were certainly some typos. But this first thing, several people walk into a restaurant at the same time. The server attends to all the white customers first. The last customer served happens to be the only person of color. The woke kind of thing would say that, yeah, that's racist that he got served last. But if I'm looking at that more nuanced, okay, what's going on? Is the restaurant busy? Is the restaurant really, really busy? If they all walked in at the same time, who came to the front and who was in the back? So, naturally you just end up serving whomever was in the front first. So if it just so happened to be that whomever was in the back whomever was the last person to walk in happened to be the person of color, then, well, if you're serving the person in the front first, that's not necessarily racism. That's just like dealing with the person who's right in front of you. There's things like that with the nuance of it. And, if you're also really stressed and really busy, how busy was the restaurant that night? And you're just like a frazzled waitstaff, you're just going to start serving people on a random dime. And it doesn't necessarily mean anything about the last person who came in. So there's a lot more nuance to these situations than a more woke kind of customer would have here. Pardon the pun. So there's a lot of that in these, and actually a lot of folks that when I was talking to them about some of these questions in the past couple of days, they did discuss that with me. That it's just like, well, it could be, but I don't know what's going on in the larger situation. I don't know what's going on with the person here. So one person that I asked about the third one in particular was like, well, what if that's just the protocol of the police station, that they impound vehicles when the registration's expired? What if that's something the officer does to everybody because he's just in general an ass? I mean, you don't actually know that, and it is impossible to make a judgment for sure if you're looking at it from the Western Enlightenment tradition, where there's actually a lot more nuance involved in a given individual situation, as opposed to the postmodernist woke version, where this would definitely be. And so, in a way, that's why I think, that's one of the reasons I think that the authors of the current study that used these questions are very much thinking of the idea that, racism is the postmodern version of it, the critical theory version of it, with prejudice plus power and so on. And that's why I don't necessarily think this is a great study here, because of course you're not clearing what the definition of racism is, I don't think, in the survey, on top of it. And also, people who are responding to this, what I can tell you is that, they could get really, really high scores on historical knowledge and still think that none of this is racist at the same time, which is a distinct possibility here. It is more of a question, I think, of who's woke and who's not. So I don't want to dwell too much on that because I don't want to run out of time. So let me go back to the actual study here real quick, and we will go on to some of the results. So as I said, with the historical knowledge scoring, they calculated a hit rate and a false alarm rate. But what got creepy for me was that they also created something called a reality attunement here. Democrats versus Republicans more often effectively discriminated truth signal from fictional noise. Oh, and you know what I didn't see? I didn't see it. I didn't see it showing up here. I would have loved to see, what's the age range of these participants, because that would say something, particularly with regard to what kind of level of good schooling did they actually get, in terms of like the general history kind of question involved here. Let's see. Robust to different things, the scoring. Okay, that's great. Democrats tended to have higher hit rates, but not higher false alarm rates than Republicans. That is, Democrats versus Republicans more often confidently responded true to true items, hits, but not false to false items. Furthermore, the index of sensitivity, referred to as reality attunement, followed the same pattern. Democrats versus Republicans more effectively discriminated truthful signal from fictional noise. This suggests that the perception of systemic racism is tethered more strongly to racial identity than reality attunement. And this is where we get at the difference in worldviews here, because I'm going to take a guess that even the folks who really had really high knowledge thought about it more carefully, just like I did with you all just now, that, well, I don't know what's going on in this situation. I can't know what's going on in someone's head, whether or not that was an explicit or implicit bias that was at it, or something else that was going on. And so I can give you your bit of why on that. I think the way it's broken down along political lines in recent years is that there's the catastrophizing that happens on one side, and there's not on the other, the more nuanced and actual prudential approach that, well, maybe it's not actually, because it is a logical fallacy to presume, without any evidence, that something happened because of discrimination or systemic bias or what have you. Without any evidence to that, you cannot presume that in here. So there's no reason for that. And I would also note that I think a lot of their questions about like current perceptions and what have you, bunch of them were really unrelated, I don't think, to the actual historical questions. And that may be by design, I don't know. But it is an observation. Let's see. Okay. Let's see. Pre-registered simple meditation. Okay. Correlation studies between measured studies 1 and 2. And like I said, study 1 and study 2 are pretty much the same thing in that they just repeated the study a second time at another time for folks. Yeah, and I was going to say, I mean, reality attunement is just a really, really creepy kind of thing. And what it is, you know, historical accuracy would be much more relevant to what what was being done here with regards to the history quiz. But you know, it's certainly fascinating. Here, but I wanted to point out something because they go on to make the point for me, because one of these things here, reality attunement, correlated with perception of individual racism and perception of systemic. And that's what this number is here for that first study, and this is for the second study. These may be significant. Yes. They're also really low. Actually, which suggests there's a lot more going on, and I would surmise that it's probably the worldview and the acknowledgement that there's actually quite a fair bit more nuance to it than just saying this is guaranteed, you know, perception of this is guaranteed to be racist and this is not guaranteed to be racist, kind of thing. You know, there's more going on there with worldview, because yeah, a lot of Republicans would not. I'm going to say Republicans, a lot of Republicans, but not all, would not perceive a whole bunch of the things that they listed there as being examples of individual racism. I do not, because I can think of the nuance of what's going on in the situation, and I have no idea what's going on in a person's head, so I can't judge that. There's no way I could pass judgment on it. And I'm not going to get into the business of just catastrophizing and accusing people randomly of something pretty damn sick and twisted, because let's face it, if you're accused of racism, it's considered one of the most damning and evil things in the United States. But I'm not going to go ahead and just accuse somebody of that unless I have some serious evidence. And just because something happens in a particular order, which was a lot of those questions with perceptions of racism for individual cases, yeah, no, I'm not going to buy that as much as others would. And I think that's a fair thing here, is that with individual and even with systemic, because in systemic it's even lower, actually, because 2 to 3. So this is correlation, reality attunement to systemic right here. 2 to 3, it's really low. Here, it's really low to begin with, the correlation of reality attunement to perception of individual racism. It's really even lower here for systemic. Significant? Sure, if they did the significance test right, it may be significant, but and I'm taking them at their word for it that it is, but it's really, really, really low. And I can take a guess because there's a lot of other things that could probably explain that relationship of why people see systemic racism versus not, and that may be just the exposure to the amount of one ideology in particular that has to do with postmodern woke perception. Whether or not you've really been exposed and believe that, compared to the more Enlightenment Western philosophy. So that's why I'm just like, no, I don't necessarily buy that it's entirely about political party. Let's see. So yeah, Democrats once again had higher hit rates, but not higher false alarm rates than Republicans. Republicans also identify more strongly with their racial group than Democrats. Oh, and this is, you know what I forgot to show you the last set of questions here. The last set of questions they had was about collective self-esteem, and this was asked after the questions on history, perceptions, individual and systemic here. But you notice one thing interesting? I often regret that. I'm glad I often feel my group is not worthwhile. I feel good about other members of my group. This is why I go back to the negative framing and the biasing of it. If you are someone already exposed to this ideology, you're coming into some of the new stuff first, then you're told all this negative stuff that happened because of the racial group that you're in? How do you know you're not going to answer more in the collective thing negative there? Because of that, is it quasi biasing that particular result that way? That's a question that I'd immediately have looking at it. The other thing is, this is where they presume that everybody has a racial consciousness and everybody believes in the collectivist kind of mentality, or they believe in the collectivist mentality and kind of put it in that way. Because there's not an option here to say, I don't look at myself as a member of a racial group. I look at myself as an individual. Now, in terms of how Republicans answered that, this is why I asked the question also, because they just say, my racial group. The question would be, are people thinking of themselves in terms of white, or are they thinking of themselves in terms of being American? Those are two different things. And generally speaking, Republicans tend to have more pride in being American than you would think. There's a lot of that going on, or at least this is my observation. That's anecdotal, but that's the question I would have on those questions. What is the interpretation that these authors have of what that means versus what it was the interpretation that the participants had when they were talking about that? Because that's another thing that could have actually affected it. That the identifying more strongly with the racial group went higher amongst Republicans. That's a curiosity question that I have when I'm looking at things like this. So let me go back. So let's see here. So, parallel mediation models. So they're looking at direct effects and indirect effects in here, and assessing some confidence intervals. Let's see. Model. Okay, so they actually modeled individual and separately. Consistent with the racial identity relevance consistent with the identity relevance explanation, the political party racial identity perception of racism and direct path was significant when examining both perception of systemic racism and perception of individual racism. You might, well, at the same time, yeah, it might be significant. It's also really damn low, and I would love to do. Here's a good fun question. If you can do the modeling based off of this and get a bunch of people to answer different questions, how well could you actually model the fit to what people would answer on certain things? Like I said, can you model it successfully? So if you have historical reality attunement and political party here, political party being, I guess, your proxy for worldview at this point, because you're not actually generally capturing everybody's worldview, because the opinions within a given party actually can be the opinions and worldviews within a party platform can actually be pretty damn wide. But that's a whole other thing. But if you were to have those two things, could you model it and get a meaning and predict what someone would perceive for each of those things in terms of systemic and individual racism? And I suspect, because they demonstrated here that as much as they think these things are significant from the testing that they've done, that they have really, really low correlations. And so I would surmise they're not going to get it as much as they think they will here. Although then again, they're not showing me the correlations here with respect to individual political parties, so I could be wrong on that. But I suspect not, because the worldviews are dramatically different. So in summary, Study 2 replicated the key findings of Study 1. In comparison with Democrats, Republicans perceived less individual racism, perceived less systemic racism, and exhibited worse knowledge of historical racism. Correlations are really damningly low, though, with respect to all of that. Involved, so let's see, structural equation model. Let's see. Research on the Marley hypothesis indicates that white Americans perceive less racism than black Americans, that racial ethnic differences in perception of racism are mediated by knowledge of historical racism, We anticipated that white Republicans have greater ignorance of historical racism and denial of present racism than white Democrats, and that political differences in perception of racism would be mediated by historical knowledge. So yeah, there is that. Although the proposed mediating effect of historical knowledge obtained for perception of individual racism in both studies, it did not obtain when examining perception of systemic racism. Rather, perception of systemic racism was strongly associated with racial identity and racial identity. Okay. No, that I could give there, but as being a decent relationship involved in that. Oh wait, no, that's wait a second. So reality attunement system. Oh yeah, that's systemic to racial identity. Yeah, that's right. I'm just making sure I read that right. Interesting. But again, I question very strongly right there. I question what were people thinking of when they were thinking to say how well they felt about their racial group, and why the heck didn't you give an option for people to not identify, well, to say that they don't think of themselves as a member of a racial group to begin with? Because there's a lot of people who don't. There's a lot of folks where it's individual rights and liberties. Exactly. So I don't know. I tend to think that there's some problems there and some things missing that kind of matter when you're talking about different worldviews. Let's see. Present findings reinforce the notion that there are robust political differences in perception of racism. Yes and no, because the real thing that you're not getting at with this is worldview. Because like I said, the woke postmodernist thing would say to all of those specific instances that I told you that all of them were probably examples of, probably reflective of racism. Whereas the more nuanced way of looking at the world, in trying to assess, what was really going on and what's the truth in the situation. And if I don't have enough facts to make a judgment on what the truth is, I'm not going to just say something damning about a situation. That's two very different worldviews. And that's actually really what one should get at here, not political differences with this kind of thing. And the other thing I will argue with that, perception doesn't always equal reality. Perception does not at all always equal reality in this. And this is where I get really aggravated with this, is to say, no, just because you think something is doesn't mean that it is in the same breath. Let's see. Oh yeah, I remember this. Present research also indicates that racial identification mediates political differences in perception of racism after adjusting for historical knowledge. Specifically, Republicans identified more strongly with the racial group than Democrats, which in turn predicted lower perception of racism in individual cases in society. These data support the argument that denial of racism is partly the function of identity maintenance concerns. That is, white Republicans may perceive relatively low levels of present racism in part because the recognition of racism threats a valued white identity. Yes, the white fragility fallacy rears its ugly head. Oh, goodness. And again, I asked the question, do you know what people were thinking of when you asked that question about their racial group? Were they actually thinking about themselves as being white, or were they actually thinking about themselves as being American? Those are two very different things here, and that's not asked with any of these particular questions at all. So that's a point to make on that. Yeah, I mean... Yeah, the white fragility fallacy, harkening back to Robin DiAngelo, who makes a pretty damn piss poor assumptions and lays in a Kafka trap at the same time. So her whole thing is a logical fallacy. And I've talked about that in other places, and other people have talked about that, so I'm not going to belabor that here. But let's just say the white fragility stuff that they're hinting at right here is a logical fallacy. Let's see. Unexpectedly, the present research supported the Marley hypothesis only when examining perception of individual racism. Perception of systemic racism triggers greater defensiveness than perception of individual racism and is strongly tied to people's racial identities. Oh, wait a second, hold it. How do you know it triggers greater defensiveness? It just occurred to me. How do you know it triggered greater defensiveness if you didn't survey the people after the fact and what they were thinking as they answered the questions? Because I read this study over quite a few times, and I don't think the authors did that. So how can you know it actually triggers greater defensiveness? Because that sure as hell seems like an assumption that's being made. That sure as hell seems like an assumption. Continue. Because research on the Marley hypothesis is largely used correlational methods, experimental studies are needed to examine whether boosting knowledge of historical racism boosts perception of racism in the present. I'm actually all for teaching as much history, and we can argue back and forth on how much of specific history is appropriate to be literate in certain things, and what qualifies as proficiency in history enough to graduate from high school, and along that kinds of things. We can argue all about that. That's totally fine. What is a problem is if you're saying boosting knowledge of historical racism, but you really mean boosting the woke postmodernist version, that is critical theory, because that would boost perception of racism in the present. Because remember, critical race theory in particular, starts from the conclusion that racism is endemic to society, and then it's their job to find it. And that's not my words, that comes from the book, Critical Race Theory and Introduction by Delgado and Stefanczyk. It's a pretty damn piss poor thing because you're starting from the conclusion with that particular ideology. It is not a theory, it's an ideology, more than anything. So, this is where I get concerned, because if you start putting, if you're starting in that direction of teaching in a more critical theory bent in schools, yeah, you're gonna boost the perception of racism, but is it actually something that's racist that you're complaining about? There's a difference between perception and reality quite a few times. Again, like I said. Thus it remains. Okay. Thus it remains unclear whether knowledge of historical racism has a causal effect on perception of racism. Okay. Let's see. Our data suggests that white Republicans have worse knowledge of historical racism than white Democrats. Like I said, I'm concerned about whether that was niche and negative framing and all those kinds of other things. Furthermore, consistent with the Marley hypothesis, knowledge of historical racism mediated political differences in perception of individual racism. These findings are of considerable theoretical and practical value, given the tendency for divergent perceptions of racism to manifest in intergroup conflict. Additional research should explore the underpinnings of political differences in perception of racism and pursue interventions that alleviate them. That's not scary at all. That last line is not scary at all. Because I can give you a very good... I gave a very good reason why you might see some of the patterns that you've seen now with Republicans and Democrats in terms of perception of racism that actually has nothing to do with historical knowledge necessarily, because if you are more exposed to the woke critical race theory version of things, where they argue that racism is present everywhere and all these things are examples and what have you, and then the like, then you're going to be more likely, logically it would follow, to perceive something that quite possibly isn't an example of racism at all as being reflective of racism. Whereas if you are of the more nuanced view that not every single interaction or every single discrepancy or disparity or what have you is emblematic of racism, then you're not going to perceive racism everywhere. That is a worldview difference. And pursuing interventions to alleviate that in the guise of, I'm not saying these authors would do that, but pursuing interventions to alleviate those differences to get people to perceive more racism sounds actually like a really bad idea, in that you would start getting all sorts of strange things that maybe, it's not actually racist at all, but you're actually having people perceive more of it and see it everywhere, as you will. That's it. Let me know what you think. I would actually be honestly really concerned that a study like this would be used to frame one whole group of people as being really bad and one other whole group of people as being really good. That's a concern I have with respect to the sort of political ramifications of this. But I also don't think it's as great as they think it is, primarily because your correlations are really low for a lot of the reality attunement thing and what have you. And I do think that that's not a difference with that's not having to do necessarily with political as much as it's having to do with worldview, in particular how much of the wokeness you've been exposed to and believe. um and the other notion there, of course, is a lot of those history questions are very niche. And so, can somebody really answer all of them correctly if they're coming out with a high school education is perhaps just a little bit too niche. And, unless you've got a really, really strong interest in history, which you shouldn't necessarily force it on people, because I said this in the other day. Um, if it's coercion, it's not. If it's charity by coercion, it's not charity. Which, in other words, if you're forced to learn it, do you really retain it? Is the other thing. You gotta want to learn it yourself, and be invested in it if you really want to retain it. You can't just be forced and expect it to stick. Really. Um, yeah, you have to have the freedom to be virtuous. Let's put it that way. If you're being forced to do something virtuous, then it's not virtuous in the slightest. That's it, I think. So let me know what you think of this particular article. Of course, links in the description. Come on over to Locals for the live chat after the show. And that's it for now. Until next time, I'm Adrian. See ya, and stay curious.